Hello everyone, and welcome to the 179th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Frieza from the Dragon Ball franchise. Well, as many of you might be aware, the day I'm uploading this video marks the 35th anniversary of Dragon Ball Z's release in Japan, and while this is definitely a cause for celebration, which is why I decided months ago to release this video today, unfortunately it's also a somber affair, as nearly 2 months ago, Akira Toriyama sadly passed away. When someone as great as Akira Toriyama passes, it's hard to put into words just how monumentally impactful they were. As for a giant like Akira, his contribution to his art form and pop culture in general is nothing short of staggering, with hundreds of works being inspired by his own that wouldn't be what they are today without Dragon Ball and Akira Toriyama. And for the many people like me out there who were raised on Dragon Ball, Akira and his works hold a special place in my heart. Every day when I came home from school, Dragon Ball would be waiting for me on Toonami, and I made sure I was there for the premiere of every movie they released in the theaters. And of course, I've spent more hours playing Dragon Ball video games than I can count, and my love for Dragon Ball has only grown stronger as the years have passed. To say that he had a massive impact on my life is an understatement, and I know that nearly everyone watching this video feels the same way. And well, all I can really say to the undisputed greatest of all time is thank you for everything. You will be missed, and I hope you're resting well wherever you are, because you certainly deserve it. Now in this video, we're going to pay tribute to one of the greatest villains ever created, none other than the Grand Emperor of the universe himself, Lord Frieza. I struggled for a while to decide on what exactly I should include in this video, as Frieza has made appearances in a lot of different media, but at the end of the day, I decided that it would be best if we only discussed Frieza's appearances in the main story, which includes Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball Super. And the reason for that is because everything we're going to be talking about in regards to Frieza in the main story can be applied to his appearances in any other story, like say the Xenoverse series or Dragon Ball Heroes. With that being said, if you think there's a particularly interesting bit of information that enhances Frieza's character in those stories, please let us know down below. And also, considering the scope of this work and the many different translations it's gone through, feel free to add anything I might have missed down below, as I'm always happy to see people contributing to the conversation on any character that I cover. Now without further ado, let's begin. Something that I don't talk about often enough with characters is their creation, and luckily for us, we've received a lot of insight into Frieza's creation from Akira Toriyama over the years, and this will both provide some context for Frieza's character, as well as some interesting information regarding his inspiration. Now there isn't a villain out there who doesn't owe part of their success to their appearance, and Frieza is no exception. Frieza's appearance is modeled after what Akira Toriyama imagined monsters look like when he was a kid, though he did also say in an interview that he vaguely remembered basing him off a queen or something that he saw in a movie. And if it wasn't obvious enough already, Frieza's name is a play on the word freezer, as when Akira Toriyama was conceptualizing Frieza, he envisioned a refrigerator. Thus this childhood monster who either looks like an alien devil, an even bigger alien devil, a spiky xenomorph, or a sleek alien-like figure, nominally embodies the spirit of modern food storage, which is why all of his henchmen's names are either plays on English or Japanese words for objects one might find in the fridge or freezer. Now each of Frieza's forms convey a few different things that contribute to his aura of villainy. In Frieza's first form, his appearance is very reminiscent of a minor demon or imp, making him look like a menacing little troublemaker who's liable to engage in some sort of mischievous behavior. His second is essentially a mirror of his first, only larger, and in that way, he goes from being an imp to a full-fledged demon who looks ready to unleash the tides of hell on whoever he sets his sights on. His third form is the most grotesque of them all, making him appear as more of a brutal beast taken straight from some dark planet who's ready to eat and consume its prey. His fourth and most powerful form, though, is ironically his least menacing, as all the trappings of a monstrosity are traded for a more sleek appearance that makes him look like an elegant and lithe humanoid creature that belies the intense barbarity of his person. But appearances, especially in the Dragon Ball universe, can be quite deceiving. Take Piccolo as an example. Piccolo was originally an antagonist, and with his pointed teeth, persistent scowl, and similarly hybrid alien and demon-like appearance, at first glance, without knowing who Piccolo was, most people would likely assume that he was a villain of some sort. But then when you get to know the reformed Piccolo, and you also get to know his people, you realize that they're far more kind-hearted than they might appear to be. Something that supports this line of thinking is the manufactured persona of Frost in Universe 6. As though Frost is a villain in his own right, he's built up a public persona in his own universe that suggests that Frieza's race has a far better reputation there than it does in Universe 7. And considering that Frieza and his family have never been fans of promoting positive public relations, it makes sense that in Universe 7 at least, that members of Frieza's race are depicted in a negative light, specifically because of the insidious actions of one family. However, something that separates Frieza specifically from potentially benevolent members of his own people, or members of other species like Namekians, is his resting Frieza face. By default, Frieza wears either a smirk or a scowl that does wonders to convey the cruelty hiding just beneath the surface. And and his red pupils do much to emphasize just how menacing of a threat that he truly is. Despite this aspect of his person though, as monstrous as Frieza's appearance is in each of his forms, it's really only monstrous because of who he is, not necessarily because of what he looks like. And indeed, who Frieza is nothing short of pure evil. In that same interview I mentioned earlier, Toriyama had this to say about Frieza's personality when asked if he had any rules for making characters. I suppose I do follow a few specific rules, but only subconsciously. Like when drawing bad guys, I won't make them so devious and underhanded that it leaves a bad taste in the reader's mouth afterwards. Not because I'm particularly concerned for the readers, but rather because I personally hate drawing that kind of stuff. Well, Frieza was pretty underhanded, but I generally don't draw things that are so unpleasant that it gets to you psychologically. Also, I paid a fair amount of attention to how Frieza talked. After all, villains pretty much always talk rudely. I thought the contrast between his polite speech pattern and his cruelty and strength was really unsettling. This makes a lot of sense, and we'll be discussing more of Frieza's personality and mannerisms in a moment. But aside from these conceptual ideas and the characteristics that one might expect to find in a villainous monster, Frieza's personality, speech, and mannerisms were partly inspired by Toriyama's editor at the time of Frieza's creation, Yu Kondo. And considering all of who Frieza is quite terrifying, I can't imagine what kind of taskmaster inspired the maniacal planet-destroying emperor of the universe. As far as his origins are concerned, like all members of his family, Frieza is a mutated member of his aforementioned unnamed race. And through those mutations, members of his family are afforded enormous natural power and raw talent that makes them some of the strongest beings in the universe. Though that might be true, it's been said that Frieza's father, who ruled his family's empire before passing the reins on to his son, was one of the most powerful, brutal, cruel, and sadistic beings the universe had ever seen. But all of these traits within him paled in comparison to his son from the moment he was born. Regardless of that fact, what little we know of Frieza's childhood suggests that he had no assistance in curbing whatever violent tendencies he was born with, as when you're born the son of a man who runs a vast universal empire built on conquest and subjugation, one's development will inevitably be decided by one's rearing in the environment they were raised in. And with his childhood being overshadowed by his father's insidious organization, as well as the tough love he claimed to have received from his parents, there was never really any hope that Frieza would develop into anything less than a tyrant who mirrored or exceeded his father in every dark aspect of his person. And who he is at the time we're introduced to him is certainly a testament to that fact. Frieza rules over an empire that was founded over 1800 years ago by his ancestor Chilled the Space Pirate. And while at its peak the Frieza Force only controlled 70% of Universe 7, that's more than enough of a majority of an entire universe's real estate to allow him to claim the title of Emperor of the Universe. Despite their organization's origins in the Space Pirate clan of Chilled, Frieza claims that the Frieza Force, unlike say the Moro Corps, is not actually a criminal organization, but a legitimate business enterprise and legal government that has secured its power through the right of conquest. Now, the labels assigned to any given organization are ultimately decided by those with the power to do so, and with no greater power around to judge Frieza's family and business in any other light, Frieza is certainly capable of making this claim unchallenged in his sphere of influence. Though that might be true, the Frieza Force is little more than an overgrown gang that engages in every type of criminal activity that free people detest, and the conceptualization of the Frieza Force is actually rooted in some less than desirable real-world activity that Akira Toriyama found especially deplorable. While Frieza and his family are known for overseeing an empire that has conquered and subjugated large swaths of Universe 7, the Frieza Force have made not just universal domination their business, but planet brokering, which entails the conquering of planets and the extermination of their populaces, so they can sell those empty planets to the highest bidder. Now, around the time when Frieza was created, Japan was experiencing an economic bubble as a result of overinflated stock and real estate prices. Several different factors contributed to this phenomenon, but one of the major culprits were real estate speculators, which are people who buy real estate with the intent to sell it later on in order to make a profit. And Akira Toriyama considered people who engage in this practice to be the worst kind of people. So when creating his most dastardly villain to date, he made sure that his profession reflected that of who he considered to be villains in the real world. Of course, what elevates Frieza's villainy far beyond that of a humble real estate speculator is the manner in which he conducts his business. And while exterminating a planet's populace or forcibly placing them under your rule is bad enough, there's a practice that Frieza and his family engage in that adds another layer of wretchedness to their actions. When members of the Frieza Force go to conquer other planets, they typically destroy all life on said planet, so they can either sell it or present it to their lord for him to do with it as he sees fit. But who makes up the bulk of the Frieza Force's forces? Members of the races they've already conquered. When Frieza or his underlings decimate a people, any surviving warriors left are offered the chance to join him, and if they don't, well then they're more than welcome to join their fallen brethren in the afterlife. And that's one of the most horrific ways that one can recruit others into their organization, murdering all of someone's friends and family before offering them the chance to continue living as a virtual slave of destruction to the force that upended their entire lives. Now, some have been more noble than others and have chosen to go down fighting, but there are plenty of others who, when presented with either life or death, choose a life of servitude in favor of the latter, and their reasons for doing so can range anywhere from a fear of death to cruel ambitions to enjoy the power that service to Frieza can afford them, like with Zarbon, who was a prince of his species who was just as cruel as his master to be, that chose ambition over honor. The exception to this rule is of course the Saiyans, who as a race entirely comprised of warriors, was far more valuable completely intact than they were if they were decimated, for a time at least. But regardless, this is one of the components of Frieza's actions and organizational structure that really sells just how horrific everything he does and embodies is. Still, there are troops in Frieza's organization who are actually loyal to him and don't follow him solely out of fear of losing their lives. One such example being the remaining forces led by Sorbet, who all seem to share his wish of reviving their precious Lord Frieza following his official demise at Trunks' hand. So while much of his forces are essentially slave fighters, there are always people out there with plenty of cruelty of their own who relish the power afforded to them by their dark master. And for a man like Frieza, who has a sinister charisma, there will unfortunately always be those who are drawn to such a figure, who are ready to do his bidding for the promise of a share of that power in return. As far as the overall structure of his organization is concerned, it's been ordered into a military force that has all the logistical apparatuses of an institution of its size, having access to the most advanced medical facilities, robotics manufacturers, weapon foundries, and spaceships in the entire universe. And all members of the Frieza Force are assigned roles anywhere from soldier to general, in accordance with traditional military structure. Like a true Machiavellian, Frieza has promoted infighting amongst his legions to disperse the power struggles amongst the ranks of his forces to better insulate himself from rebellion. And while the various soldiers and commanders of his army work together to serve their master, frequent plots and schemes to usurp one another are constantly popping up and sowing discord. And loyalty amongst the ranks of the Frieza Force is only begrudgingly displayed out of necessity rather than truthfully, examples of which you can find in the various conversations we see people like Zarbon and Dodoria having with each other, or the many antagonistic relationships Vegeta and his other Saiyan comrades have with nearly every other member of the Frieza Force. A contributing factor to this internal strife is without a doubt the racial diversity of the Frieza Force, as rather than all these different races choosing to work together because they're open and welcoming of other species, every member of the Frieza Force is either from an enslaved race that has been forced to coexist with other races that help to conquer their people, or they're cruel and merciless members of races who have decided to side with Frieza willingly, that hold their noses up at the various people they fight alongside, which is especially evident in the way that all the other races typically refer to Saiyans, labeling them as nothing more than barbaric upstart monkeys, who are the laughingstock of the entire Frieza Force. So in these ways, the Frieza Force is very reminiscent of a feudal system, where various noble houses are constantly trying to usurp one another's power in order to either take the throne of their kingdom for themselves, or to get themselves closer to said throne. Only rather than noble houses, it's the militaristic criminals of various races who are vying for their own personal power at the expense of every other member of the Frieza Force. And again, this type of organizational structure provides Frieza with significant insulation against more organized efforts aimed at chipping away at his power base. For a business like his, this is an ingenious way to structure it, but to what degree we can claim that this is an innovation of the mighty Frieza is shoddy at best, as it's more likely that this is a long-standing practice of his family that has further enabled their success over the near 2 millenniums that they've been operating in Universe 7. That doesn't mean that Frieza owes all his success to the genius of others though, as Frieza is monstrously intelligent in his own right, and he needs to be in order to effectively control such a vast criminal empire that holds millions, if not billions of planets under its thumb. And Frieza makes sure to keep tabs on individuals or groups under his control that he suspects of plotting to betray him in the future, like Vegeta or the Heater family. Now, without a doubt, the most defining aspects of Frieza has to be his cruelty, sadism, and utter lack of mercy. And if it wasn't made clear enough already by his profession, Frieza sees people as little more than playthings, insignificant beings who he perceives as being so far beneath him that their lives mean absolutely nothing to him. And this even applies to members of his own forces, as regardless of their position in his organization, we often find Frieza acting just as cruelly to his minions as he does to his other victims. Frieza is seen numerous times threatening to murder subordinates who displease him, like with Zarbon and Dodoria when they fail to apprehend Vegeta. But Frieza isn't just a man who delivers empty threats. He's more than willing to murder his soldiers if he feels the need to, an aspect of his character that's shown to us in our first chronological introduction to him. Because of Frieza's status as a diabolical prodigy, King Cold was eager to pass over the reins of power to his son from a very early age, and not long after his son reached maturity, King Cold began the process of introducing his son to his various vassals as their new emperor and overlord. 41 years prior to the start of Dragon Ball Super Broly, Frieza arrived on planet Vegeta with his father, and here we find he's every bit as cruel and callous as his father promised he would be. Frieza begins by saying hello monkeys to the kneeling Saiyans, and he immediately instills terror within them by first stating that he has high expectations for them, and hopes for their sakes that they live up to them, then afterwards donning a scouter and obliterating 4 towers holding Saiyans with guns that were trained on Frieza's landing party. After gifting the Saiyans with 500 scouters, Frieza leaves with his forces after making a joke, telling King Vegeta that if the 500 he gave him wasn't sufficient, that he was free to complain if he wished. In this short interaction, we're shown some of the more defining features of Frieza that were evidently present from the very moment that he obtained power. His mannerisms are sweeping and grandiose. His manner of speaking is snide and laced with an overwhelming sense of superiority, despite the polite choice of words we often find him defaulting to, all of which is underpinned by his sinister holier-than-thou laugh that chills one to their very core, conveying in so many ways his sadism, twisted sense of humor, and his ever-present cruelty. There are plenty more examples were given of Frieza's cruelty towards his subordinates on a smaller scale, and in many of the more personal examples of his eradication of subordinates, we can find Frieza expressing immense joy in doing so. But these actions more so seem to be tied to the idea that Frieza has a zero-tolerance policy for dissension in his ranks, perceived uselessness, and failure, as it would seem that Frieza expects nothing short of perfection from his subordinates, all of which are reflected in actions like his obliteration of a man named Namol after he's called the Ginyu Force to planet Namek because he had outlived his usefulness to him, his statement that he would have loved to have seen Captain Ginyu's face when he was defeated by Goku, and his blasting of Tagoma into outer space in Resurrection F for daring to give advice to him. But the two most massively egregious examples of this behavior can be found in the massacre of the entirety of his forces on Earth after they've been defeated by lower-powered members of the Dragon Team in Resurrection F, and of course, in his complete destruction of planet Vegeta and nearly the entirety of the Saiyan race. 5 years after his introduction to King Vegeta, Frieza's cruelty would be unleashed on a far grander scale when he chose to destroy planet Vegeta and nearly every member of the Saiyan race with it. At the time that this occurred, Frieza generally had no cause to fear any single being in the universe aside from Majin Buu and Lord Beerus, whom his father had warned him never to meddle with. But these larger-than-life figures were so far off that they were hardly a threat to his power, lest he go looking for them. So the only beings Frieza really needed to fear were any members of the various races that populated the galaxy, and fortunately for him, there were never any that he encountered that ever came close to mirroring even a fraction of his power, all save for one species, the Saiyans. Unlike the many other races that Frieza and his family had conquered or exterminated, the Saiyans presented a special threat. The Saiyans' powers grew stronger after each defeat, and when banded together, especially in their great ape forms, they were an enormous force to be reckoned with, the mightiest beings amongst the many other races who served under Frieza. By the time Frieza decided to exterminate them, several Saiyans had begun to show an increased level of power that was concerning him, one example being Goku's father Bardock, and these increases seemingly supported something that Frieza was concerned about more than anything else, a legend that dictated the eventual birth of a Super Saiyan and a Super Saiyan God that was destined to become the strongest fighter in the universe. Knowing that the Saiyans only served him because they were forced to, Frieza feared that one day soon such a warrior would rise to challenge him, and with a powerful fighting force backing him up, it would only be a matter of time before Frieza and his entire army would be at the mercy of an unstoppable Saiyan threat. So Frieza chose to do what he does best, destroy them all in order to eliminate this looming threat. And with his signature supernova ability, an entire planet and the race that inhabited it is completely destroyed in a matter of seconds, all while the demon who unleashed this massive show of force laughs as the beautiful fireworks he created spark all around him, the sadism of a tyrant who delights in the sick beauty that destruction conveys to a person like him on full display as he's overwhelmed with joy as all the agony he's inflicted on these people resonates through empty space as millions perish in a symphony of horror before his very eyes. Now, aside from showing us to what monumental lengths Frieza will go to secure his power, what this act shows us is that the supposed strongest being in the universe isn't immune to feelings of fear and paranoia, as he is a man who helms an insidious organization that's filled with some of the worst killers in the universe, who needs to be wary of all potential threats to his rule. Now, despite his willingness to dispose of his subordinates at the drop of a hat, there are times when Frieza has shown himself to be merciful, as he is open to giving people who displease him a second chance if he believes they can still be useful to him, like when he offers Zarbon and Dodoria second chances at apprehending Vegeta when they failed to do so the first time around. It's even implied that Frieza actually likes some of his minions, like the members of the Ginyu Force, who show him such a high level of admiration that strokes his ego enough to earn them his affections. But another example is given to us when he's fighting with Vegeta on Namek, as here he expresses his displeasure at Vegeta's rebellion, despite knowing that it was inevitable, because he actually enjoyed his company, a fellow ruthless tyrant-to-be that he developed a degree of kinship with due to the similarities in their personalities. And once he's beaten Vegeta to a pulp, he even states that he cares for him enough to put him out of his misery, rather than torturing him further than he already had, like he's wont to do with others who have found themselves staring down one of his sinister ki blasts. However, this type of affection should be likened to that of a pet owner favoring certain pets, as in reality, Frieza, at least at this stage in his life, had little to no respect for anyone or anything. Now, as callously brutal as these things are, what he subjects those who work for him to pales in comparison to the horror he unleashes on his enemies or innocent people. We already know that Frieza either orders entire populations to be destroyed or does so himself, and we get a more personal display of this behavior in Resurrection F when he destroys an entire city to announce his arrival on Earth. But we're given a much more intimate look into how Frieza toys with innocence when he's attempting to conquer the one thing he truly fears above all else on planet Namek. Here we see that Frieza and his minions have been on a tear since they arrived on Namek to search for the key to Frieza's immortality, collecting several of the Dragon Balls by subjecting the native Namekians to torture and murder should they refuse to acquiesce to the wishes of their new lord. We either hear of or see Frieza threatening to kill all the Namekians in several different villages, including making threats to one village elder by promising he'll kill all the children present in his village should he refuse to hand over his Dragon Ball to him. But once he does obtain this Dragon Ball, he leaves without killing the remaining Namekians, stating that the Dragon Ball is an equitable trade for the scouters they destroyed, showing us that Frieza will show a bit of mercy if he's in the mood for it. But he does make sure to threaten the kids one more time before he takes off. Even with all the cruelty he's expressing in these moments, Frieza's manner of speaking does reflect the civility and politeness that Toriyama wanted his character to convey, even if the people that he's speaking to politely understandably aren't so fond of returning said politeness to him, like when he's speaking with Guru with a decent amount of respect, and he only chastises him for his villainy in return. Now, once Frieza is forced to enter the fight on Namek after his subordinate's many failures, we're treated to a level of sadistic cruelty throughout the rest of the Frieza saga that's very reminiscent of a child ripping the heads off their dolls. In general, the entire fight between the team of Piccolo, Gohan, Krillin, and Vegeta can be seen in this light. When Frieza transforms into his second form, he gores Krillin on one of his horns. He proceeds to bounce him up and down to torment him further as his friends can only look on helplessly, laughing maniacally and making jokes all the while. Piccolo is also subjected to a brutal beating at Frieza's hands, beaten within an inch of his life as the tyrant toys with all present as cruelly as he possibly can, further strengthening the horror of his actions as his fight with Goku begins to unfold, as here he murders helpless individuals like Dende, the defeated Vegeta, and of course Krillin, blasting them all without a second thought, though even here, there are morsels of mercy that we receive from Frieza, like with his willingness to stop torturing Vegeta as I mentioned earlier, and when he tells Piccolo that he should flee because it would ease his conscience if he spared one Namekian. But whatever virtue can be found in these statements is far outweighed by the terror of his actions. Echoes of these cruelty can be found in every instance Frieza is presented with an opportunity to further his ambitions with any given violent action, like in Resurrection F when he has Goku on the ground and begins tormenting him, stating that he needs to wake up because torture is no fun if he can't hear him scream. And while his propensity to inflict agony on anyone who crosses him, and thoroughly enjoy it in the process, is one of the hallmarks of his character, second to his barbarity has to be his massive ego, overconfidence, and arrogance. In Frieza's mind, all beings in the universe are inherently inferior to him, even those who are in fact superior, like the gods of destruction, the Kais, or Grand Zeno. As prior to being beaten by Goku, Frieza was under the impression that he was in fact the strongest being in the universe, who had no equal. And considering he'd never had to exert even a fraction of his power to keep 70% of the universe under his control, he was quite justified in believing this to be the case. And I'm sure even with the warnings he was given by his father regarding Majin Buu and Beerus, he felt that it was only a matter of time before his personal power, or the power of his organization, would become mighty enough to eclipse even that of the various gods and demons of the universe. Frieza's egotistical narcissism is gargantuan to say the least, and he's as arrogant as one could possibly be, wholeheartedly believing in his innate superiority, an aspect of his character that's reflected in every grandiose speech or chastising remark that he's made against nearly every being that he's encountered. A man who through his polite demeanor always manages to insert some sort of declaration of his greatness and superior strength to assert his dominance and instill fear within his opponents and allies alike. While his confidence and arrogance are negative aspects of his character that are actually significantly detrimental to his ambitions, as I stated earlier, these feelings of superiority aren't exactly unfounded. At the time we first canonically meet Frieza on Namek, Frieza's strength is on par with that of the newly minted Super Saiyan Goku, and this immense power that he has wasn't achieved through hard work. He was simply born with it, accomplishing naturally what another had to train intensely for under strenuous circumstances, without ever putting any effort into training himself and enhancing his natural talents. But Frieza's natural abilities are even more profound than that, because when he does actually apply himself, it's arguable that he is in fact the strongest being in the universe. After Frieza is resurrected by Sorbet and Tagoma, Frieza learns that in the time he's been gone, Goku has grown so exponentially powerful that he even managed to defeat the legendary Majin Buu, an entity that his father had warned him about confronting due to the impossibility of defeating such a powerful force. In this moment, Frieza actually learns some humility, and rather than rushing at Goku to take his revenge, he instead resolves to train for 4 months before heading off to face his rival. With only those 4 months of training, Frieza manages to attain a power that's equal to the Super Saiyan Blue form, though because he rushed off to fight them before truly perfecting his new Golden Frieza form, he's incapable of sustaining the massive energy required for such a form for very long. Regardless, this shows that Frieza is so naturally gifted that he can achieve powers that other incredibly strong beings took 10 years of intensive training and battle experience to achieve in just 4 months, a power that has only grown stronger through meditating on Goku's demise while interred in Hell by the time he's revived to fight alongside the Dragon Team in the Tournament of Power. After the situation with Broly resolves, and Frieza returns to the far reaches of space to continue reforming his power base, we next meet Frieza at the end of the current saga in Dragon Ball Super, and here we learn that Frieza has achieved a new, more powerful form, Black Frieza, something he achieved by training in a hyperbolic time chamber for 10 years after he found it on a planet he conquered. And in this form, Frieza is strong enough to easily defeat Goku and Vegeta in their strongest forms, True Ultra Instinct and Ultra Ego, in just 1 hit. So by training for the same amount of time that it took Goku and Vegeta to reach Super Saiyan Blue, Frieza has become several degrees more powerful than even that monumentally powerful form, and one can only guess what kind of power he can achieve if he continues to dedicate himself to training further beyond this point. So with these things in mind, I think it's actually quite reasonable to assume that Frieza really is the strongest being in the universe, one that's capable of surpassing even the hero of our story in might and prowess, should he take the time to own his skills in a proper manner. However, there's something that will always hold Frieza back from reaching his true potential: his arrogance and his enormous ego. Now, if you were raised by a man like King Cold and spent your formative years learning the inner workings of a universe-spanning criminal enterprise, of course you're going to develop an enormous ego that, while assisting you in your dreaded work, only hinders whatever potential you might have had were you born under different circumstances. A good comparison to make here would be one between Goku and Vegeta. Had Goku never been sent to Earth, and was instead raised amongst the remaining Saiyans in the Frieza Force, it's probable that he would have only ever unlocked a fraction of his power, just as Vegeta had prior to fighting Goku on Earth. But because he was raised under a different value system from his overconfident Saiyan brethren, he learned the value of hard work and dedication that allowed him to rise above his people's propensity for resting on their laurels and never seeking to improve themselves beyond the admittedly massive power. This is what always keeps him one step ahead of Vegeta, who at numerous points in this story has reached levels of power that rival or exceed Goku's. But Vegeta has only managed to contend with Goku's power because he has partially taken the values of his rival to heart and used them to enhance his own prowess. But not completely, as Vegeta is still egotistical and arrogant enough that it hinders whatever potential he might have that could possibly allow him to truly surpass Goku once and for all. And while Frieza is just Vegeta, but to an even greater degree, a man who is so full of himself that even though he's begun to properly train himself, he can likely never achieve his true potential due to the detrimental aspects of his personality. Another thing that hampers Frieza's abilities is the fact that he's more often than not a sore loser who is incapable of expressing any meaningful level of humility that could instill within him the introspection he would need in order to surpass his foes. And to make matters worse, he's also a coward and a dirty fighter who will do whatever it takes to undermine his opponent with any shady tactic he can use in the moment. And when he's defeated, he's not even above begging for mercy, which he does after he's cut in half by his own technique on Namek and Goku is about to leave him to die, which is ironic considering that Frieza rarely ever shows mercy to anyone that's ever found themselves on the other end of his malicious cruelty. Now these are all the central aspects of Frieza's character that are more or less present in every scenario we find him in. However, the revived Frieza we see in action at the time of the Tournament of Power does undergo some significant changes, while also displaying some villainous traits and skills in his diabolical arsenal that weren't needed prior to this part of the story. Before this saga, we only really ever saw Frieza relying on overwhelming force, or his minions, to accomplish his goals. But once he's forced to actually work with people, and is presented with numerous powerful obstacles that require him to maneuver this situation with a bit more finesse, some more treacherous aspects of Frieza begin to show themselves. When Frieza is first revived, he shows himself willing to engage in treachery against the forces fighting to keep his own universe alive by offering his services to the gods of Universe 9, Sidra and Ro, by stating through a communicator brought by two assassins that were sent to kill him and Goku that he could kill Goku for them and join their universe's team to better ensure both their survivals. This sort of treacherous behavior would end up becoming a quintessential aspect of Frieza's strategy during the tournament, as not only does Frieza see this as an opportunity to regain his life through his participation in the tournament, but as a way to manipulate the gods into conflicts with one another to curb their powers and sow discord within the ranks of the godly. Here we also find Frieza teaming up with his dimensional brethren Frost, using his powers as a tool to eliminate lesser participants in the tournament and toy with people like Gohan to derive sadistic glee from the torment inflicted upon one of his most formidable enemies, an erstwhile ally. Frieza's manipulation of Frost can be seen as a greater example of how he conducts himself with his own forces, as Frost essentially becomes an understudy to Frieza, who trusts him to guide him through this tournament for their mutual benefit. However, Frieza ends up betraying Frost as one might expect him to, but even so, this is probably the best example we've ever been given of the more manipulative side of Frieza, with a possible exception being what he puts Broly through during the events of the Broly movie. And this aspect of Frieza is one that he again really never had to show previously, due to overwhelming force historically being his primary and most effective tool when resolving any situation. Another change that Frieza undergoes here, though, is that he displays a willingness to work alongside his teammates when he isn't actively trying to sabotage their efforts in some way. And while he really only does so out of necessity, considering he'll be erased along with everyone else if they lose, Frieza ends up being such an important component of Universe 7's team that they actually owe their victory to the plan he made with Android 17. Though Frieza promises to return to his evil ways after the tournament is concluded, and he's been revived by Whis, it still stands that when the time came for Frieza to do the right thing, he begrudgingly did so. But whether or not you can call this a true change in Frieza's character, or behavior that was manifested out of necessity, is up for debate. However, what might indicate that Frieza has undergone a change of some sort is the fact that he seems more eager to continue seeking fights with Goku for the sake of fighting a strong opponent worthy of his abilities, rather than just for revenge. And when you consider that at the end of the current saga in the manga, Frieza chooses to simply knock out Goku and Vegeta, rather than killing them when he comes to deal with a newly powered up gas, this could be a turning point for Frieza that may mark a new era of more honorable conduct on the battlefield from him. Now that we've become familiar with who Frieza is, and many of the horrific things that he's done, we have to ask ourselves one very important question. What is Frieza's true goal? Or in other words, why is Frieza such a diabolically evil bastard? Well, he was essentially made to be this way due to the circumstances of his birth and his rearing by his father and his organization, as we've already discussed. But aside from that fact, Frieza does all that he does in order to acquire one thing: power. Frieza is a self-absorbed megalomaniac who truly believes he is the most supreme being in all the universes, one that doesn't have to bow to even the creator of said universes, because he, as the mighty Frieza, is destined to become ruler of all that exists by virtue of his overwhelming might alone. It might seem at times that Frieza does all the horrendous things he does because he just enjoys inflicting agony upon people. But as much as he enjoys destruction and murder, Frieza only really indulges his desire for carnage when it's appropriate for him to do so, as there is never an instance in any story we encounter Frieza in, as far as I'm aware at least, where he murders or destroys simply for the sake of doing so. Whenever we find Frieza blowing something up or murdering someone, he always has some practical reason for doing so. He didn't blow up Planet Vegeta and wipe out all the Saiyans just to enjoy the fireworks. He did so because he felt the Saiyans were a threat to his rule. He doesn't murder any of his subordinates on a whim. He does so when they've outlived their usefulness or when they've displeased him in some way. Violence and destruction are not the end-all be-all for Frieza. They're byproducts of his quest for ultimate power that he certainly finds joy in, but are still byproducts nonetheless. No, the true goal of Lord Frieza, Emperor of the Universe, is to one day rule over everyone and everything. And while ruling over an empty universe devoid of subjects is no way to rule. So as much as Frieza enjoys sowing chaos and destruction, he would never let himself become a universe-ending apocalyptic monster, because that would run counter to everything that he's trying to achieve. So far, Frieza's supremacy in the universe has always been tempered by the efforts of Goku and his friends, and while it's not realistic to assume that Frieza will one day rule over all of existence unopposed, I assume soon enough here, we'll find Frieza rising to challenge the supremacy of the Omni Kings themselves. And who knows, maybe he'll actually manage to achieve his dreams, for a short time at least. So after taking into account everything we've learned about this megalomaniacal narcissist, I feel we need to ask ourselves another important question. Why is Frieza considered the most beloved and infamous villain out of all the nefarious figures that have popped up throughout the long history of this story? Well, I think that's because there is something so inherently fascinating about characters like Frieza, who falls under the category of a Dark Lord. I've said it many times before, but personally, Dark Lords and other tyrants are my favorite type of villain, because as much as they trade some moral complexity and nuance for in-your-face and unabashed evil, they are the ultimate in moral corruption, a force so monumentally evil that they have no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And while there's typically some sympathy to be found in their backstories, in this case Frieza's rearing by his father that ensured he would turn out to be some sort of horrific person, ultimately, they are villains that you can hate with no hesitation, a character that you're always sitting on the edge of your seat waiting for their next horrid action to play out, whose downfall you can always cheer when they inevitably succumb to the forces of good that they were so quick to discount as envious weaklings who cling to silly concepts like mercy and honor. And all of this is only made more intriguing when we're provided with an equally virtuous foil to such a dastardly entity, in this case, that foil being Goku, a man who represents all the virtue, humility, and kindness that's intrinsic to moral goodness, who is everything Frieza isn't and could have been had he not been corrupted by evil. So there's a very good reason why Frieza is the most iconic villain in the Dragon Ball universe, because he represents everything that our heroes aren't, the ultimate villain whose sickeningly elegant way of conducting himself contrasts the brutality of his actions to make him one of the most guiltily delightful characters to watch in action. And because Goku is one of the greatest heroes ever conceived, and Frieza is the direct opposite of that great hero, he has inevitably become one of the greatest villains ever made. And while there have been many who are inspired by him and who have tried to imitate him, no one does what Frieza does better than Frieza. And just as Goku is the purest representation of goodness, Frieza is more than deserving of being one of the greatest representations of pure evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Frieza? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.